Welcome back, AP. All right. So today we talked a little bit about the second industrial revolution, interchangeable parts, the distillation of petroleum, processing of rubber, blah, 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 right? Things that make life a little bit more functional, things like that. We talked about how that was a culmination of the ideas of Faraday, Mendeleev. Freud's psychoanalysis is not really related to that, but he's still a very big evidence-driven idea behind the progression of science and thought during the late 1800s, right? So another big thing that's going to lurch forward, though, is the concepts of sociology, right? So the study of society itself. When you got guys like Edwin Chadwick and Jeremy Bentham running around being utilitarian and trying to progress society forward, you begin to do certain things to basic scientific studies for society itself, right? So take the objective idea of science and apply it to society in a way that makes more sense, which is ironically super Baconian when you think about it, because he had been advocating for that for 200 years before this whole trend even happened, okay? So massive amounts of data are now going to be formally compiled and acquired in urban settings now, because functionally you have the ability, you don't have to traverse great territories to figure this stuff out, but different things, the statistics on crime, children, rates of death. Marx is a great example of one of these scientists. Karl Marx did a huge compilation of data just so he could understand the plight of the poor, leading into his ideas behind his Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital and a lot of different other concepts as well, right? Marx is a great example of taking the objective ideas of science and applying them to society, right? So, but another big one, though, is Auguste Comte, right? Which is a French social philosopher known as the father of sociology, right? He came up with this concept called the method, which is the scientific method of sociology, trying to understand how a society understands, copes with, and deals with issues, right? He postulates the idea, the biggest idea that he actually came up with is his idea when it refers to metaphysics and how, like in a way, like Immanuel Kant and his idea and applying them to the ideas of sociology. He postulates the idea of learning on a societal scale, right? Which is going to get into very well the next phase that we're going to talk about when we get to evolution, right? Because certain times society restricts ideas because they're just not quite ready for them yet, right? So he postulates the ideas of learning as a society, right? He comes up with three phases. The theological phase, which is religion-based. The metaphysical phase, which is the abstract, unprovable ideas, right? Like we know this exists, but we don't know how. In the theological phase, you're like, oh, this exists because of our religion. And then the metaphysical phase is this exists, but we don't know how. And then the scientific phase is understandable and positive in progression of being going forward, right? And evolution is a great idea to use as an example of this construct, right? So getting into it, though, I'm now moving on to a boring PowerPoint because I didn't have enough time to edit, but let's view. All right, there we go. So evolution is a great way to actually analyze how a society was grappling with a concept they basically didn't necessarily want to understand and didn't have the ability to understand, right? So Comte's ideas are exemplified in the fascination with the ideas of evolution, right? Early evolutionary thinkers. Let's talk about something really quick, dispel some rumors you may have heard. It's not like Charles Darwin rode the HMS Beagle to the Galapagos Islands into South America and then all of a sudden said, evolution, no one's ever thought of this method. There were guys that came before him that he took their ideas, combined them, and then spun them a little bit using his study of tortoises and birds to try and understand how we exist in this current phase of life from thousands and thousands and millions of years of natural selection, right? So Charles Lyell is the first guy, right? He applies the positivist method to geology, right? He then discusses that the earth was not necessarily created in our theological perspective by God. Maybe also it wasn't the metaphysical phase where we know it's old, but we don't know how old, right? The earth was formed over eons. He figured that out in his scientific phase. It's formed over eons of pressure and movement, not biblical floods or cataclysmic events, right? Eons of slow shifting movement, right? He's an early evolutionary thinker because he begins to push the bounds of society. Push the bounds of society, right? Jean-Baptiste Lamarck is another evolutionary thinker. He actually issued the idea of all forms of life rising from old forms over a long process. He takes Lyell's ideas of the earth and then moves them into animal life, right? His, though, ideas were flawed because he believed only in things like catastrophism, the idea that something crazy has to happen to cause a change in an animal, right? Whereas there's a lot of missing pieces. So his early works, Lamarck's early works, were not accepted. But then Darwin comes along, right? Charles Darwin, the man you know, the myth, the legend. You all know this guy, right? 1809 to 1882, right? Ironically enough, his ideas came around before Freud's ideas, right? Freud was a much more like World War I era thinker. These guys are kind of all over the place. You just need to know what they believed in. You understand what I'm saying? We looked at like psychoanalysts by itself because it's psychoanalysis, right? We looked at Mendeleev and Faraday by themselves because it's general sciences, right? Now we're looking at sociology and the acceptance and understanding of a giant concept through Comte and then going into Darwin. So I know these guys are all over the place, but again, the grappling with evolution is the perfect thing to discuss. Now, he was actually friends with Lyell, right? Persuaded and used fossil evidence to prove that life was in fact ancient. This is a huge premise because according to the Bible, the earth is only a few thousand years old, all right? So this flies in the face of a theologic construct. Now, did most of the scientific community agree with the fact that it was older than the Bible said at the time? Yes, because they're in the metaphysical phase, right? So his key concept, though, is the struggle for survival. In his book, The Origin of Species, that he waited around to publish. He had it done for years, but he waited to publish it until actually, from what I was told by a college professor, a fossil of a certain animal was discovered in Germany while crazy Ludwig, this guy like that was building these castles all over the place and was obsessed with Wagner, when having one of his castles built, they discovered a fossil that they couldn't quite explain. And following this discovery, Charles Darwin issues his Origin of Species because he feels society is ready, right? This draws on Malthus's ideas of population growth, that you will outgrow your food supply, so the strongest thing in society will prevail while the weak fall. That's natural selection, right? Now, can you reverse natural selection? Of course you can, but we're not going to get into that right now, all right? We'll talk about reverse natural selection tomorrow. But Darwin's core argument bases itself on chance differences. Mutations wasn't discovered until the 1900s with the study of genetics and like post-Watson and Crick, right? So the short-necked giraffe model. So according to Darwin's theories, he did believe in natural selection, but he didn't know what a mutation was. So he thought it was chance differences, right? Like, oh, like little chance differences. And the big one is the short-necked giraffe model, right? You've heard the short-necked giraffe model? Short-necked giraffes died out because they had a chance difference that they had a short neck. And then the other chance difference was there were long-necked giraffes. And the long-necked giraffes had the ability to feed at a faster rate, keeping them healthier, producing more offspring, and then ensuing to spread all over the world while the short-necked giraffe ones died out, right? Reactions to this idea, very, very mixed, all right? Everyone usually brings in the ideas like, oh, everyone in Europe freaked out and said no. Most of the scientific community, especially people that have turned towards the atheistic kind of perspective, loved it. Even though Darwin himself never stopped believing in religion, he was kind of upset that it was like, oh, well, these are the only people that are taking my ideas and running with it. Theologians hated it. And he's like, oh, no, I wasn't trying to make you upset either, right? And then it came up with this idea called the mechanism controversy, which I'm not going to bring that up right now. Just remind me to talk about it tomorrow because I don't want to take up too much of your time. But remember, be like, what's the mechanism controversy? All right? What is that? It's very simple, okay? But we'll talk about it later. This became a huge, huge debate, right? So politically speaking, it turns into this back and forth, where people were saying, oh, look at this idiot. He's afraid of the idea that he came from a simpler form of life. And then the other side being like, look at those idiots. They think we evolved from apes, right? So it turned into a political spectrum kind of a thing, where people began to accuse Darwin of being an atheistic outlier flying in the face of the ideas that came before him, and others saying, no, this makes a lot of sense. We should take his ideas and try to run with them a little bit, right? There are even several, this would last all the way up until the mid-1900s. There's the Stokes monkey trial, right? You heard about that whole thing in U.S. history, I'm assuming, where it's not Stokes. It's the Scopes. The Scopes trial, where like a teacher was actually put on trial for teaching evolution in a public school, right? So a lot of different political aspirations that went along with it. This is the last slide, okay? So the twisting of Darwin's ideas is going to be running rampant, right? And people are going to take it negatively and positively. So it was a very big split in society. Scholars are going to begin to try and take Darwin's ideas and apply them to fields in an attempt to rationalize political and economic motives. Put a star next to this and say this is the worst thing that could have possibly happened, because you cannot take biologic principles and apply them to economic principles, right? They're like, oh, well, the small companies will die and monopolies are the way to go. That's aggressive, all right? So, oh, well, sociologically speaking, people of this race are more dominant. That's messed up, right? So social Darwinism, which is stupid, by the way, believes that human affairs would drive people into unending economic struggles to determine the fittest for survival, right? If that's the case, then mixed race is actually on the boom because it's the highest growing racial demographic in the world, right? So it endorses, this is supposed to be 2 bullet points underneath social Darwinism. The problem with social Darwinism, it endorses hatred of the poor, other races, and undeveloped countries, right? So this became a huge economic, political, and ideological split, all right? So, and that's it, right? And this is the end of this unit. I believe so anyway. Let me double check the standards. We might have a little bit to add tomorrow, but I don't think so. But we'll talk about that stuff later on. So I hope you all have a good evening. See you tomorrow.